Good afternoon, class. This is my 9th lecture in the course of selected readings in British and American poetry. I'm going to talk about Robert Frost, and my topic is a road less traveled by. This is, well, the agenda I prepared for this afternoon. I will first give an introduction to the life of Robert Frost. And then I will talk about Frost as a poet of deceptive simplicity. And after that, we'll have a close reading of his 2 poems, Stopping by Woods on a Snowy Evening and The Road Not Taken. Now first, life of Robert Frost. Robert Frost enjoyed great popularity during his lifetime. Not many American poets have had their poetry as well-known, widely read, highly honored as Robert Frost. Frost well transformed the poetic landscape. His life and work are often associated with New England landscapes, but his reputation transcends the regional boundaries. He did not publish his first book of poetry until he was 39 years old, but his poetic career lasted for about 50 years. On July 4th, 1913, Robert Frost wrote to his friend John Bartley, describing his strengths as a poet. He says, "To be perfectly frank with you, I'm one of the most notable craftsmen of my time. I alone of English writers have consciously set myself to make music out of what I may call the sound of sense." For about half a century, until his death in 1963 at the age of 89, Frost was the unofficial poet laureate of America, recipient of more than 40 honorary degrees from colleges and universities, including Oxford and Cambridge in the same year, 1957. Even at the age of 85, his public reading of his own poetry in a quivering, hardly audible voice still attracted thousands of listeners who were satisfied with just being there with him, enjoying the cadence of verse. Frost was born in San Francisco, California, educated at Lawrence, Massachusetts, died in Vermont. But he was pretty much loved as a New Hampshire poet because he lived in New Hampshire for more than 40 years, between 1895 and 1938. This is a picture of his dairy farm in New Hampshire. In 1892, Frost graduated from Lawrence High School as a class poet, and he shared a valedictorian honors with Eleanor Marion White, whom he married 3 years later. After graduation, Frost attended Dartmouth College briefly, without taking a degree, taught at the Salem District School and also at his mother's school, served in a Lawrence mill, and worked as a newspaper reporter for the Lawrence Daily American and the Sentinel. Frost wrote poetry in his spare time and published his first poem, My Butterfly and Elegy, in the November 8th, 1894 issue of Independent, a New York magazine. This is a picture of New York magazine, Independent. I took the picture from Howe Libraries, a Howe collection of rare books for literary studies. at the University of Florida just a month ago. Here is Frost's poem, My Butterfly, included in the magazine. There is a note here which says this was the first magazine of national circulation to accept Mr. Frost's poetry. Frost and Eleanor had 6 children. Of the 6, 2 died in childhood, 1 in childbirth, 1 of suicide, and 1 who ended up in a mental hospital. However, Frost and Eleanor faced financial difficulty, and they struggled as a team, homeschooling their children. Eleanor supported Frost when he tried his hand both as a farmer and as a teacher before his poetic career took off. Eleanor was instrumental in managing Frost's career. The young couple was challenged in all ways imaginable, and the inevitable tensions in such a lifelong friendship and partnership are alluded to in Frost's poems, letters, and conversations. In 1897, Frost entered Harvard University, but left again before completing degree requirements because of his being affected by tuberculosis and the birth of his 2nd child. 3 years later, the Frost's eldest child died, an event which led to marital disagreement, which Frost later addressed in his poem, Home Burial. It's a poem about the different attitudes toward the death of the eldest child. After years of his largely unsuccessful farming in New Hampshire and his inability to interest American publishers in his poetry, Frost sold his farm and moved his family in 1912 to England, risking everything to become a poet. From 1912 to 1915, Frost, his wife, and their 4 children lived in England. And during this time, he met such literary figures as Ezra Pound and Edward Thomas. Both Pound and Thomas wrote appreciative reviews that helped establish Frost's reputation as a poet in England. His first book, A Boy's Will, was published in 1913 in England and received appreciative reviews. Following the success of this book, Frost published his 2nd book of poetry, North of Boston, in 1914, which also won critical acclaim. This is, a copy of the first edition of Frost's A Boy's Will, which was published in London in 1913. And this is a copy of the 1914 edition of North of Boston. And the first poem of North of Boston is Mending Wall. Just after the contents of North of Boston, Frost wrote, Mending Wall takes up the theme where a tuft of flowers in a boy's will laid it down. A tuft of flowers is a poem in A Boy's Will. And the last 2 lines of A Tuft of Flowers are like these. Men work together, I told him from the heart, whether they work together or apart. Frost has long been considered as a poet of nature, but the subject of his poems is almost always the humanity. So this is a good example to illustrate this reading of his poems. Men work together, I told him from the heart, whether they work together or apart. So it's a poem about the relationship between man and man. The Pasture. This poem was printed on the frontispiece of North of Boston. Soon after North of Boston was published, Frost's family returned to the United States in 1915, settling in Franconia, New Hampshire. Upon his return to America, Frost was a successful and celebrity poet. The American editions of his first 2 volumes of poetry won critical acclaim upon their publications in the United States. And in 1917, Frost began his affiliations with several American universities, both as a professor of literature and poet in residence. And he won 4 Pulitzer Prizes, New Hampshire in 1923, collected poems in 1930, a further range in 1936, and Venice Tree in 1942. A poet of New England soil, Frost spent most of his mature career on farms in New Hampshire and Vermont, while serving intermittently as poet in residence at Amherst, Harvard, Michigan, and Dartmouth. Perhaps his most moving appearance was his recitation of his poem, The Gift Outright, at the inauguration of President John Kennedy in 1961 for millions of Americans. Okay, now my second topic is Robert Frost, a poet of deceptive simplicity. Xianan, would you please read out the poem for class?
The pasture. I'm going out to clean the pasture spring. I will only stop to rip the leaves away, and wait to watch the water clear I may. I shan't be gone long. You come too. I'm going out to fetch a little calf that standing by the mother is so young it totters when she licks it with her tongue. I shan't be gone long. You come too.
Thank you very much. So, it is not difficult for us to understand the story in the poem. The first line presents the background of the farm and the man who cares for it. I'm going out to clean the pasture spring. The speaker is going out by himself in early spring to clear a spring of water. He says that his work will be very brief, but he invites the addressee to go with him. I'm going out to clean the pasture spring. I'll only stop to rake the leaves away and wait to watch the water clear I may. I shan't be gone long. You come too. In the second stanza, the subject switches from the spring to a little calf, which is so young that it stands tottering beside its mother. And again, the speaker asks the addressee to go with him, to fetch it. I'm going out to fetch the little calf that's standing by the mother. It's so young, it totters when she licks it with her tongue. I shan't be gone long. You come too. So we can easily reconstruct the whole scene in our imagination. However, the 2 small quatrains show how the least may mean the most, offering the reader and the writer alike the delight of saying an ordinary thing while discovering that it is art. On the first level, if we take the speaker I as a farmer, the whole poem here will prove to be a picture of vigorous farm life in early spring. At this time of the year, farmers are making preparations for the growing season. In this case, the springtime clearing of the dead leaves left over through the winter may suggest the rhythmical continuity of life and death in nature. In the second stanza, an image of a toddling calf beside its mother symbolizes a future full of promises. On the second level, the speaker I may also be seen as a worker, a caretaker of growing things, who helps things happen. Since a man's life is a limited span, so is his every action. In contrast with the eternal image of the timeless cycle of seasons and the limitless universe, each limited span of each action by man comprises in its temporality something eternity. So we see eternity in temporality. So the farmer's actions are only finite representations of an infinite or timeless reality. But they can be repeated year after year, one generation after another. And perhaps, this is the way Frost unifies earthly limitedness with universal unlimitedness. On a third level, since Frost takes this poem as an introduction to his poetry, the speaker I can also be regarded as the poet himself, in which case the poem might seem to be a manifestation of the poet's thought about his poetics and poetry. The dead leaves he wants to rake away in the first stanza may suggest the old-fashioned versification of the 19th century, with which he wants to break. While the little calf, struggling to stand by itself, symbolizes the kind of new poetry he has written. The invitation, therefore, can be seen as the poet's invitation for the reader to appreciate his poetry. The poem stands not only as an invitation to his poetic world, but also presents the figures that are central to that world, the poet, the reader, the natural setting, and animal. In this way, Frost has very artfully drawn us into complexity. So my reading is that the simplicity in Frost's poetry is deceptive. If you are interested in this topic, you can read my book, A Road Less Traveled By, on the deceptive simplicity in the poetry of RobertFrost, which was published 2000 by Peking University Press. And I have a micro-teaching lecture on RobertFrost as a poet of deceptive simplicity, which happened to win the second prize in the first national micro-teaching competition among university teachers in China last year. And this is the address on the web. Okay, now we'll have a close reading of Stopping by Woods on a Snowy Evening. Now let me read aloud the poem for you first. Whose woods these are, I think I know. His house is in the village though. He will not see me stopping here to watch his woods fill up with snow. My little horse must think it queer to stop without a farmhouse near, between the woods and frozen lake, the darkest evening of the year. He gives his honey spells a shake, to ask if there is some mistake. The only other sounds the sweep of easy wing and only flake. The woods are lovely, dark and deep, but I have promises to keep, and miles to go before I sleep, and miles to go before I sleep. The core of the poem is no more than a simple description about how a man pauses one evening along the country road to watch the snowfall in the woods, which are lovely, dark, and deep. As he gazes into the soft, silent whiteness of snowing evening, he is charmed to stay on, losing his track of thought in the enchanted woods. His consciousness seems to be freeing itself from reality, as if it were about to dissolve in the snowy emptiness of this rural scene. This is perhaps what Frost called a momentary state against confusion. Sometimes we do feel sad, frustrated in our life, and want very much to escape from reality for just a short period of time. But at last, his mind, the speaker's mind in this poem, holds back from this escape. He remembers that he has promises to keep and miles to go before he can yield to the dreamlike release extended to him by the woods. This is a moving personal experience, beautifully depicted. But one of the lines that interests me very much is line 8, the darkest evening of the year. The question here is, why does the man pause and ponder over the woods that are lovely, dark, and deep here? Literally speaking, the woods in New England area are deep because they are thickly forested New England woods, even impenetrable. The woods are dark, for this is the darkest evening of the year, December 22nd, which is the shortest day of the year, just before Christmas. But this darkness, according to Frost's recollection in 1947, also means to the poet a darkness both in time and economy. Frost will recall the times were hard for him when his family was living on a farm. Once, when Christmas was drawing near, he packed his wagon with some farm produce and made a long trip into town, hoping that he could exchange his farm things for a few small Christmas gifts for his children. But as times were hard for everybody, there proved to be no sale in town. As he headed home disappointedly, evening came and it was snowing. His heart grew heavier and heavier. Even the horse was sensing his despair and was going more slowly. And just before they came to the view of his house, he realized that his family might be expecting him anxiously. How could he face them? He saw no way to spare his family the despair he felt. The horse slowed down and then stopped at the sweep of a bend. The horse knew what its master had to do. Frost will just sat there and cried like a baby. Another line in this poem that interests me very much is line 13. The woods are lovely, dark, and deep. The woods hold a mystical attraction for the traveler who finds himself alone between the two opposing worlds of nature and man. Even his horse knows that one does not usually stop before reaching the village, especially on this darkest evening of the year. Nature in this poem becomes fascinating at first, with the help of easy wind and dawning flake. the woods seem to be a place which offers the speaker a momentary escape from his promises. The man's responsibility to the village, to his family, is diminished for a moment by the apparently vast domain of the woods. He begins to find solace in nature. However, in this comfort lies danger. Sleep, as we all know, by its very nature, is a common symbol of death. So is darkness, and snow too, because of its association with the danger of winter coldness. Woods are also a familiar image for danger, and their darkness and depth give a sense of uncertainty. So the woods here stands as a synecdoche for nature. It seems in this poem that man must learn both to accept and to reject the poor of nature. In the end, the traveler dismisses the mysteries which the woods have to offer in order to keep the unnamed promises waiting him in the village. In Frost's lyric poems, nature appears to be indifferent, dangerous, and even hostile to human beings. The man in this poem is presented as an isolated individual, published in his book of poetry, New Hampshire, in 1923, and this poem illustrates many of the qualities most characteristic of Robert Frost, including the attention to natural detail, the relationship between man and nature, and the deceptively simple way of his poetic presentation. Now, the road not taken. It's on page 186. The road not taken. Two roads diverged in a yellow wood, and sorry I could not travel both, and be one traveller, long I stood, and looked down to one as far as I could, to where it bent in the undergrowth. Then took the others just as fair, having perhaps the better claim, because it was grassy and wanted wear. Though as for that, the passing there had warmed them weary about the same, and both that morning eagerly laying leaves no step had trodden black. Oh, I kept the first for another day, yet knowing how way leads on to way, I doubted if I should ever come back. I should be telling this with a sign. Somewhere ages and ages hence, two roads diverged in the wood, and I took the one less travelled by, and that has made all the difference. In Oxford Companion to American Literature, it says the poet, in this poem, tells how the course of his life was determined when he came upon two roads that diverged in a wood. Forced to choose, he took the one less travelled by, and that has made all the difference. But this poem, it seems to me, might be interpreted in another way. As we all know, Frost and his family moved to England in 1912, after their farm in New Hampshire failed. And it was during this time in England that Frost met and was influenced by such contemporary British poets as Edward Thomas and Robert Graves. In the fall 1914, Edward Thomas often visited the Frosts. Thomas and Frost often went out for walks. But whenever they came to a crossroad, Thomas would habitually ask Frost which road to follow. Frost once said to him, "No matter which road you take, you will always sigh, and wish you had taken another. This image of Thomas, who got stuck at the crossroads and was quite at a loss about what to do, which road to take, inspired this poem. This is the story behind this poem. Indeed, every one of us will come to certain crossroads in our life and will wonder which will be the better one. Perhaps most of us will pick up one that has been less traveled by, and thus be thought a nonconformist. However, this poem sheds an ironic light over this desire. I should be telling this with a sigh, the speaker says, and the sigh doesn't echo a sense of release, a sense of, instead, it suggests a certain sense of sadness, anxiety, or even insincerity. It seems as if the speaker is looking back from his old age with his grandchildren at his feet and says, I took the one less traveled by, and that has made all the difference. While in his heart, he knows that he just pretends to say so in an unnatural and affected way. My question here is there a road less traveled by in this poem? As the poet has suggested in the first 3 stanzas, the road taken is just as fair that morning. The poet notices that the passing there have warned them really about the same, and the next line is more explicit. And both that morning equally lay in leaves no step had trodden black. It would seem that both roads are fresh, as if new and untrodden that morning. And this certainly puts an ironic twist on the last aphoristic couplet. I took the one less traveled by, and that has made all the difference. It is typical of Frost poetry that, the poet builds up in his poem a striking contradiction. The speaker points to a simple and even symbolistic reading of the poem, while the poet himself demands a more insightful, ironic interpretation of the poem. Frost almost always seems to be simple, direct, and natural. But actually, he's almost always never as simple, direct, and natural as he appears to be. Frost was different from many of his contemporary poets who agreed, just as T.S. Eliot says in his essay, Metaphysical Poets, which was published in 1921, that our civilization comprehends great variety and complexity. And this variety and complexity, playing upon a refined sensibility, must produce various, complex results. The poet must become more and more comprehensive, more elusive, and more indirect. In other words, as I've mentioned at the beginning of this class, the modern society is complicated. So the poetry to reveal this complicated society should also be complicated. That is what, T.S. Eliot says here. The poet must become more and more comprehensive, more elusive, more indirect. But Frost was different. Frost wanted to embrace an audience who could buy books in 1,000. He therefore took a road less traveled by. Here are some reference books for your further study. Undtmer's Letters of RobertFrost to Louis Undtmer. And here we have, Professor Cao Mingren's translation of Frost's poetry. Here are my 2 books on Frost's study. Okay. Thank you very much.